All right, so the other day I posted the video on my thoughts on the Ona engines and John Deere garden tractors, and I indicated I was going to do a video right after that of comparing garden tractors themselves, old versus new. I think that's what I said, or something along those lines. Um, and then I got a couple comments, which actually I need to look those up real quick. I got a couple comments on that video and some of my older videos. Um, and I feel like the overall people are very undecided, or you end up in one of two camps for old versus new. And I simply don't think that old versus new is really kind of a campy thing, because they both have their perks. I do believe that. And I mean, obviously, I own both old and new equipment. But I figured I would spend a few minutes. I don't know, this video will probably be 15-20 minutes long, so hopefully you bear with me on my thoughts. I actually had to make some notes on this one just to make sure I got all the statistics right, because I wanted to talk about new versus old in terms of statistics, because or specs, because JSER, I think that's how you say his name, made a comment. He wanted me to compare the 300 series John Deere with today's same style and spec, and you'll go away crying. That was his comment. And then Geppetto's replied to that. LOL, I run a 1979 314 and a 78 316 with a Kohler 321 K 341 Kohlers, and maintain an L120 my mom uses. There's no comparison. We'll be keeping the old iron going. Completely agree with keeping the old iron going. I mean, obviously, I have a lot of fun doing that. In fact, I mean, if you watch a lot of my videos, I'm almost, I've kind of grown, not necessarily out of the garden tractors, but I've definitely branched out. I mean, you know, in previous videos, I fixed that Caterpillar generator. You know, I have interest in older pieces of equipment. I really enjoy older pieces of equipment, but at the same time, what I do as a hobby is not for everyone. So I figure what I would do with this old versus new comparison, really, a lot of people start that question, which one do I want, old or new, or they'll have a specific comment or a specific machine in mind. And I'm going to go ahead and preface my entire video here by stating that when I talk old versus new, I am comparing only garden tractors. I am not comparing lawn tractors. I'm not comparing lawn and garden tractors. I'm only comparing what I would classify as a true garden tractor. And I would take that anything from, say, the 1963 110 all the way up to the X7 series of today. I'm not considering mowers. I'm not considering 345 or a 285 or a 320. For those of you that know what those are. I'm not considering one of the X500s from present day production, like the X580, things along those lines. I'm only considering Deere's largest garden-sized machine at the time. And so I think it's important to note how I am discussing, or what I'm discussing in that context. And a lot of people ask, well, what machine do I need? And I think the first thing you have to decide is, you know, do I need a garden tractor? There's a lot of really helpful videos out there on YouTube specifically answering that question. I don't think I need to rehash that one. And then you have to decide, okay, well, what is it going to boil down to? For most folks, it boils down to cost. The older it gets, the less expensive it gets. In most cases, unless it's a very rare machine or has some type of collectible value, things along those lines, which I think a lot of people tend to forget about at times, that there are collectible machines out there that are going to be much more expensive than your regular average garden variety machine. For instance, recently on Facebook, I've seen a number of 1963 110s come up for sale, and people give the seller a hard time because they're asking, you know, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 for these machines, when you can pick up a 1965 110 for $250 to $500, depending on condition, things along those lines. So I do think that's an important thing to note. But how do you decide if you want new versus old? I think obviously, aside from just the straight cost, which once you start talking about spending several $1,000s, people get very realistic about, hey, I can actually buy a new one because John Deere has been offering 0% for so long because the cost of money is cheap. And really, if you get into an old machine, you're going to have to concern yourself with some type of more involved maintenance, more involved upkeep. And that's what got me into this hobby to start with. Is I wanted something to mow my yard with. Well, at the time, we didn't have a lot of money. Lived in a duplex, and I was tired of push mowing our yard, and so I went and bought a 320. And from that 320 devolved into a 318, which is actually older. And then the 318 sheared a flywheel key. And up until that point, and this was in 2012, I had never, I could probably change the oil on an engine, but I had never taken an engine out of a mower or anything else before. And, fortunately, I had a neighbor that was a mechanic, and he helped me out a little bit and kind of got me started on this whole pathway. And here we are 8 years later, and everything that I have collected in my hobby. Sorry, my computer's about to go to sleep here. So after you've decided old versus new, or when you start talking about old versus new, you need to consider cost of the machine. Obviously, a new garden tractor is going to be $10,000 to $15,000 or more, depending on options. And now you have the 1 Series out there that leads to the invariable question of should I step up to a 1 Series? You got to think of space. Old machines are a little bit smaller, particularly when you get back into the older gear drive units or the 140s. They are significantly smaller than an X Series. I mean, that is a perk of the older stuff. But what I really wanted to get at is specs. So I'm just going to read you off some specs I have written down. I spent a little bit of time writing down some specs. In 1963, John Deere introduced the 110. It was 7 horsepower. 7 horsepower Kohler K161 engine, 38-inch deck, 38-inch mower deck, fabricated deck. In 1964, they bumped the horsepower up to 8 horsepower. In 1966, they introduced the 112, which had 10 horsepower. And really, they kind of stepped the horsepower up from there. In 1968, they introduced the 140 that originally had a 12 horsepower engine. In 1969, they came out with the Kohler 14 horsepower engine in the 140. 1975, the 300 had a 16 horsepower engine. 1979, and also 1975, you had the introduction of the John Deere 400, which more or less had that 20 horsepower, a Kohler K532, I think, 19.9 horsepower. Maybe I have that engine wrong. And then in 79, you had the choice between the 17 horsepower 317 with the KT17 engine in it, or the 400 again. 1983, you had the 420 come out with 20 horsepower or a 20 horsepower B48G engine from Onan. 1984, you had the first introduction of the Yanmar diesel engine and the 1984 430. And really, I mean, that trend continues until 1992 when you introduced the 22 horsepower diesel 455. And I guess the 445 didn't come out until 93, I think. So then you have the electronically fuel injected 445 that came out, I guess, a year after the 455 did, which is also 22 horsepower. Really, and diesels kind of topped out at 24 horsepower when the X5 or X495 and X595 came out. Kind of topped out at 24 horsepower. They really haven't gone above that. And really, the gas engines topped out at 27 horsepower in the X720s. They had the 27 horsepower engine. Now they're down to 25.5. So horsepower has drastically increased over the years. We've gone from a single cylinder cast iron engine to liquid cooled, some type of composite material, aluminum or some type of it's not a cast iron block. I mean, the Onans are aluminum block with cast iron liners. And so when you start thinking about those kind of things and improvements, when JSER says compare the 300 series with the same style and spec and you'll go away crying, Um, yes and no. In some regards, there is no direct replacement to the 300 series. When John Deere came out with the 425 got rid of the triple hydraulics and the split brakes that was in the 400 series. And at the same time, you still maintained the dual hydraulics, but you ended up with differential lock from the 400 series. So really, uh, Deere combined the 300 and 400 series together into one line, which you can actually debate endlessly on that one if that was the right move or not, because obviously there have been a lot of people add H3 or third hydraulic function to their garden tractors over the years. And at the same time, you have the 318 kind of drop back to what became the 345, and I would guess the direct replacement for the, or kind of at the same time for the replacement would be the 320. But the really kind of indirect replacement for the 318 was the 345. So spec wise on the 345, no, it is nowhere near the older 300 series. I mean, obviously you lost some of that downforce ability on the front attachments. You lost some of the pressure out of the transaxle, and obviously the transaxle and the pump in the 345 and really 335 and 325 is not nearly as strong as Sunstrand 15U pump that was in the 318 and 322, 332, that whole group of machines. And so if you're going to compare spec to spec, the older 300 series doesn't necessarily have a direct replacement. So what you have to do is, I think the easiest thing to do is compare a 420 to a modern day, say, X730. Now, I have zero experience with X730. I've driven a couple. I have never owned an X730, but they're both gas. They're both two-wheel drive. They can both handle 60-inch decks, front attachments, snow blowers, 3-point hitches, etc. And honestly, I think that capability-wise, they are nearly identical in capabilities. You do lose the split brakes and you do lose the 2-speed transaxle in the X730. And several people have told me that probably the best pulling garden tractor the Deere ever made was the 430. And I've had a couple people tell me the 430 will walk the dog on even an X748. I personally don't have any experience with that. I don't think a 430 overall will have the same. I don't think a 430 will have the same overall capabilities as, say, a 4-wheel drive X Series, but I do think it does have some capabilities over a 4-wheel drive X Series. And that's probably a whole nother video in and of itself. I mean, really, this is kind of scratching the tip of the iceberg, what I'm talking about here. But to go back to compare directly that, say, the X730, because that's what we've picked, and the 420, because I think that's a fair comparison that we can make in terms of machine to machine. First off, we'll start off with costs. A 420 in today's money would actually be more expensive. Now, I didn't look any of these numbers up, but my guess is if you actually put in an inflation calculator, a 1992 420 would probably be close to $17,000 to $18,000 in today's money. Whereas an X730 you're probably going to pick up for $12,000 to $13,000 after tax, equivalently set up to that $17,000 to $18,000 420. Now that I'm sitting here, I really want to go and talking about this. I really want to go look up the prices of those. So cost-wise, an X730 is cheaper, relatively speaking, than a 420, or at least it should be based on my knowledge that I have in my head. And really, when you start looking at spec-wise, so engine horsepower, you got a 20 horsepower Onan, which undoubtedly will probably have more torque than the Kawasaki that's going to be in the X730, the 25.5 horsepower Kawasaki, but you got an extra 5.5 horsepower. And we have to remember that horsepower in these machines is not necessarily like we're measuring horsepower in the D and the E series, where they'll drop a 27 horsepower engine in a a 27 horsepower engine in a D170 or E170 or E180, whatever it is. It just seems like a monstrous amount of horsepower to run a 54 or 52 or 54-inch deck. But we have to remember that we are running all of that power through a hydrostatic transaxle that is set up for ground engaging. I think one of the things that I said in the last video, and maybe I said it in a previous cut, so I can't remember. I have been into both of the differentials and the entire powertrain of a 420 and the entire powertrain of an X Series. And I can tell you that there's mechanical differences, obviously, but in terms of robustness, design, 6 of one, half dozen the other, to be perfectly honest. They are both very, very stout transaxles, very, very limited failures. They both have their weaknesses. In the K91, K92 transaxle, it is known for busting, well, it can bust axle tubes. It will do that on occasion. The frame of the machine will. That's a somewhat rare occurrence. And it will also break the differential gear. Somewhat rare occurrence, and generally it has something to do with a higher amount of traction. So a lot of weight behind the machine or something along those lines, you'll break a tooth and normally punch a hole in the bottom of the transaxle case. Meanwhile, the 420, its big problems are, one of the big problems with the 420 is it shears axles. The 420 and the 430 are both very, very good at breaking axles, and basically that's because that axle is about 2 inches longer on the 420, 430 than it is on the 318. And when you start poking around, you see that the same axle was actually used in the F930 series machines, F935, things along those lines, which also have a big axle shearing problem. And I don't necessarily think that it's a huge flaw, but that is something that 420s are known for. At the same time, a 420 does not have the onboard hydraulic capability of running its own loader. And undoubtedly, when people buy these machines, a loader is an extremely popular thing for people to want to put on them. And frankly, an X730, even though you can't get a factory loader on X730, it's going to be better at running a loader than a 420. I mean, that's just, I think that's going to pan out every single time, particularly with the pressures that the transaxle is capable of, because a loader on a 420 has to have its own independent hydraulic pump. Now, a lot of guys will run a hydraulic line off the front hydraulic ports of a 420, work perfectly fine, but it's slow. I mean, the most you're going to get out of it's about 1,000 PSI, or you're going to wear that Sunstrand pump out extremely quick. And ultimately, the two machines have come up with 2 negatives for each one and 2 positives for each one. I think that's what I've done over the last probably 5 minutes or so. And I see I'm already at almost 19 minutes on this video. And I mean, you can tell that I'm kind of scratching the surface on what these machines are capable of. So to go back to spec, basically comparing spec to spec, it's extremely hard on old machines to new machines, because there are so many differences that it's hard to directly compare them. However, I do think there's some comparisons to be made, and I think a 420 X730 comparison is a very fair comparison to make. And I think at the end of the day, if I was a buyer and I had the extra money, I would buy the X730. Only from a standpoint of the 420, the last 420 rolled off the assembly line in 1992, which is almost 30 years ago. And it's a machine, most 420s are 30 plus years old. It says nothing about the capabilities of the machine. Capability wise, I think maybe the X730, just in terms of ergonomics and deck capacity. I mean, you think about a 60-inch high-capacity deck, which is very similar to a 60-inch 7-iron. That 60-inch deck on the X730 is going to have a higher capacity than the 60-inch deck on the 420. Now, I will absolutely grant that the 60-inch deck on the 420 is an extremely good deck. It is the same architecture that is on my 455. the 60-inch deck on my 455. And I really, my opinion is, and I've said this in many videos, I think cut-wise, that 60-inch deck on the 420, 430, and the older 4-5 tractors, I think is probably one of the best cutting decks that Deere has ever produced, aside from the 7-iron. The 7-iron has the capacity that the older 60-inch decks just simply do not have. You can cut taller grass at a faster speed because that deck is so much deeper. So at the end of the day, I think I would choose the X730, only from a standpoint of it's newer. If you bought it brand new, it would come with a warranty. If you bought it used, I mean, you go look through used machines right now, and you're going to find a 420. My guess is you're probably going to pay somewhere between $1,500 and $2,500 for a good 420, and for a used, so say a 500 to 700 hour used X730, you're probably going to pay anywhere from $5,000 to $7,000 in most cases, and you can go buy a new one for 10 to 12, 13, depending on the dealer, day, etc., and deck and all kinds of things like that. And so, you know, at the end of the day, I think if I had the money, I'd probably choose the X730. And then, I mean, the next discussion we could have is diesel versus gas, and I bet you that video would even be longer than this one. So hopefully that answers some of the things to consider, you know, spec-wise on these machines that I didn't necessarily mean to pick on a particular comment, and hopefully JSER doesn't think that I was picking on his comment, because I think it's a really important thing to do to compare spec to spec, because it's extremely hard to do. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the camera off, and I'll show you my bookshelf that I can get a lot of this stuff from, and I'll tell you a little bit about what's in each book. All right, so when I start talking about specs and prices and stuff like that, I think it's really important to actually go back and get true specs for machines. And I've shown a lot of this stuff in videos before, in terms of prices and machine information and stuff like that. So like in this binder, we have John Deere Grounds Care and Recreational Products, covers a lot of tractors, and this is from 1996, so this has the 425 in it, whereas this one I believe is a 1992, which is going to have the 318, and it's extremely hard to get this stuff out one-handed, so I really can't, I'm not going to get it out right now. And then you start comparing prices, so these are consumer price lists. I think this one's from 84 to 91 basically, and there's some different years in there. And then I believe this is a 95 or 96, and this is a 2004. And so when you start comparing prices like that, I think that's where I get my price information from. And then these are all price binders from the 70s and early 80s. So this would cover some of those older machines. And, you know, so basically what I'm trying to say is when you really have to sit down and look at the specs if you want to compare them. And I've actually got a whole nother bookshelf of all of the newer styled specs. Several years ago, I did a bunch of John Deere history videos with some basically going over the introduction of the X585, or X485, X585 machines, and the 45 loader, things along those lines. So hopefully that answers some of your questions and where I'm coming from in terms of specifications for things and items like that. And if you got any questions, comments, leave them below. I really hope this video isn't too long. It'll probably be approaching 25 minutes, but I think it's got some decent information for people to have. So thanks for watching.